From highways and streets, rail, freight, and aviation to newer multimodal options like scooters and car share apps, my next guests think a lot about how our transportation needs are changing on an almost daily basis. Robert Puentes is the president and CEO of the Enos Center for Transportation, which provides research and analysis to policymakers and industry leaders. Harriet Tregoning is the director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, a group that channels tech-based disruptions in urban transport. That means it's the cool stuff out there, the cool new stuff. Robert, let me just start with you for a moment, as I also know that you were in one of my other favorite places in town, the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, which is sort of the smart, best and promising practices and how cities and urban centers should run themselves. So can you give us a snapshot of what is, I don't know how to put it, what sucks in transportation infrastructure right now that we need to fix?
The problem that we've had for a number of years is that we haven't done a really good job in maintaining the system that we already have in place. We did a really good job in this country over the last few generations building new stuff, but we have not done what we've had to do to upgrade, modernize, and just generally just do more upkeep on the existing system. So if there's one thing that we need to do over the next few years, it's making sure that we're repairing what's already in place.
Do you think,
at the same time,
we're going that
sure
direction?
we're outfitting it with all new tech. Yep, sorry.
Are we going that direction? Are we beginning to move that direction?
Some places are. There are some places that are being forced into it because of the fiscal conditions that they're finding themselves in, but it's a big country. It's also a very fast-growing country in a lot of ways. So there are certain parts of the country, the Intermountain West, for example, parts of the South, where they are still building a lot of new infrastructure to accommodate a lot of new growth. But we're accommodating it in the old traditional ways, which facilitates the need for more investments because we're spreading out further and further. And as we do that, we tend to neglect what's going on in existing places and in the dense urban core. So there's not one answer to the question about what's happening, but clearly we need to do a better job of maintaining what we've got overall.
Thank you for that, Harriet. One of the beefs I have with some of my media friends who report on scooters and ride sharing and bike share and ride hailing and all the new stuff is they think the millennials did it all. I tell them, I wanted this stuff too. That the kind of like putting it, giving the credit to the younger crowd may be wrong. But I'd love to get your sense, particularly, I live in D.C., so I've seen a lot of this come to the Washington area, and I know you've been responsible for a lot about it. How is it working out? Where are we on the curve, if you will, of moving to a much more nimble, much more clean and green transportation system that fits the habits and needs of our citizens in cities?
Well, I think
we just lost Harriet.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, great.
I think what you're seeing in DC is an example of what other cities could also be doing, which is that we have almost 40% of our households are carless, and that's in many cases by choice. That means that they're only spending about 9% of household income on transportation compared to the regional average, which is 19%. So it means that it's a level of affordability that makes households resilient. And I think that the proliferation of choices that we have here has made that really possible for people to say, either I can have one less car, or maybe I can go without a car at all. And I think that kind of change, which has happened over just a couple of decades here in the district, maybe less, is possible in lots of other cities.
Well, Harriet, how is it going, like, in terms of how I should call it? If I wish I had a measuring stick for the magnanimity of different traveling groups. At the beginning, when you had auto drivers, I remember the hostility the first times I was driving one of the shared bikes. Now it seems to have worked out. There's an equilibrium there that people seem to be able to live with. Now with scooters, it seems to intend. But do you think at all about how to get mutual understanding and respect between different transportation modalities?
So I think that the need for that respect is in part mitigated by infrastructure, the thing that Rob was talking about, that you would have the infrastructure for slower moving traffic, whether those are scooters or bikes or even pedestrians, not being in close proximity to fast moving cars. The other way to do it is to make the entire jurisdiction safer for everyone by slowing the speed of cars. And both of those things are being attempted in Washington right now. So I think that the growing ubiquity of these other options and the fact that even drivers use these other options some of the time has led to more understanding and more respect for the other users of the road.
Thank you for that. Robert, let me ask you a kind of similar question from a different angle. I've hung out interesting evenings unexpectedly with kind of futurist urban planners, who sort of talk about, how searching for parking places will end because of, total information and various dimensions of this, or looking at how transportation infrastructure, particularly in trains and transit, is going to change so much. I'm interested in what the biggest blind spots are when it comes to urban mobility questions that policymakers make and don't see. I mean, I'm just wondering, you've been through this so many different times. What are the typical mistakes in perspective or planning that would help smarten us up?
I think part of the problem is that we don't take a holistic look at transportation. We tend to treat transportation in its silo, and we don't make transportation decisions for what transportation is designed to do, right? We're not just driving around or walking around or scootering around for the fun of it. Well, maybe scootering sometimes, but we are trying to do something. You're trying to accomplish some kind of goal or get to some place. So when we think about transportation in isolation, we get transportation related outcomes. That's fine. But what we need to do is do the things that Harriet was talking about. And how do you make this more a part about how we build our communities? How do we make this more a part about our efforts to reduce carbon and affect climate change? How do we make transportation part of our desire to increase access, particularly for low-income neighborhoods and racial justice and things like that? Once you take transportation out of its box and connect it to all those things that we know it's designed to do, you exponentially increase its effectiveness. And so that's one thing I think we don't do very well. The other is that we also rely on the federal government to do an awful lot of this, which there's clearly a federal role in all kinds of areas of infrastructure, particularly transportation. But when we talk about, as you had before, about a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, people think, well, that's so big that only the federal government is the one who can be working on that. But the reality is the cities and the states particularly have an enormous role to play in all of this. So the federal government can do an awful lot to help spur the innovation that gets to the things you were talking about. Break down silos, encourage innovation, learn from best practices, pilots. There's a huge demand right now for places to learn from one another, and the federal government can have a really big role to play in that.
Steve,
Harriet?
can I jump in
Yeah,
on
please,
that
please.
question and with Rob? I think that how the federal government gives out that money makes all the difference in terms of what kind of outcomes you give. So just putting it out as a formula grant and saying spend it however you want at this moment in time is going to be a huge mistake. Rob mentioned access. Most parts of the country, most states, the thing that the transportation system is designed to do is to reduce congestion, not to provide people access. So that would be a fundamental watershed change to make access the number one thing that transportation is intended, is supposed to accomplish, and measure it against that.
Well, Harriet, I want to give you credit for retweeting a tweet that I love and get your both comments on it. You retweeted out, it was the end of September, but it was still relevant. You say 2.8 million essential workers rely on transit every day. A new COVID relief bill is being drafted that includes funding for airlines, but not transit. Does your nurse fly to work? Call your representatives. It's a very interesting comment about the times we're in, and I got to tell you, there's a lot of money going to planes and airlines and all that. But when I look at buses, the metro, these sorts of issues, and with all due respect to this wonderful city, I wonder, are we safe enough with our health guardrails? Do we have the systems and ventilation systems? Let me just ask you both, what do we need to up our game on when it comes to thinking about this time, public health, and still moving people? Harriet and Robert?
Well, transit is certainly a lot safer than the initial reports seem to indicate. That the CDC suggested, among others, that the high rates of COVID in New York were all about transit, when in fact globally, there's not really been any a significant transmission associated with transit systems, and in fact, the air replacement for transit is much higher than in an office building or an apartment building, for example, in a restaurant. So I think we scared people off of transit needlessly, and those transit systems need riders. People need to get to places. So I think part of what every transit system needs to do, and if we had leadership in the federal government, what would also need to happen is a consistent message about wear a mask, but it's safe to ride transit.
Thank you. Robert, your thoughts on this moment? I mean, part of the reason I think, I keep wondering, whenever you have a massive national crisis, it gives you permission to spend. What Harriet just said is, let's not do that by, silly formulas. Let's get the guardrails right. But I'm just wondering, at this moment of a health crisis, can we do something with the social contract? Can we do something smarter than we're doing in the name of this crisis that leaves us better off at the end? Your quick thoughts?
Sure. I think we certainly do need to take care of aviation and our aviation sector. And I think there has been movement that way, and for lots of good reasons that needs some attention. But when it comes to public transit, we do need to think a little bit differently, because transit is one thing. But when we often say that, I think we're thinking about subway systems. We're thinking about the metro here. We think about the MTA in New York, the ones that are very visible and make for really good shots when the news is down there talking about what's happening in stations and things like that. But transit is very different. And, the folks who are riding heavy rail systems, the subways, have a very different demographic profile than folks who are taking the bus, for example. So where you started with this for essential workers, we know that bus ridership has declined, certainly, but not nearly to the extent as commuter-style transit services have, because we know that the bus is really the backbone of transportation access for many communities, particularly for low-income communities, particularly for essential workers. So you may have seen drops of in the 40-50% range for bus, which is pretty significant, but nothing like commuter rail, for example. Long Island Railroad, 97% drops. Metro here, 85-90% drops. So when we think about transit and we think about its role in the recovery, we've got to think about who it's designed to serve, how they need the system, and then what we can do pretty cheaply, actually. Harry and I were talking about some of the bus innovations that are happening in cities all across this country right now, and even was going on before the pandemic here in the Washington region. Just painting red lines on 8th Street has done enormous work to move buses faster, to make them function better as part of the overall transportation system. We should keep doing lots more of that all across the country, and I think we will.
Well, thank you. Well, we have a question from the audience for you both from Bernie. Bernie?
Hi, I'm Bernie Brill, Executive Director of the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors National Association's Mid-Atlantic Chapter. And my question for you today is dealing with COVID-19. With the spike in numbers we're seeing in hospitalizations and test scores, is there any sort of acceptance or awareness of what we can expect to see happen in terms of air purification systems in college dormitories, apartment buildings, office buildings, hospitals, that sort of thing in the future? Will we see a demand for air purification systems? Thank you.
So thank you, Bernie. So that's a little outside the transport area, but I'm interested in, as you have a purview of this, and Harry, you kind of addressed part of it with regard to a misunderstanding of what may be the reality in certain transit systems. But how do you look at this need now potentially for more air purification systems? Harriet?
I don't even know if it's necessarily purification. I think one of the issues is the circulation. So how is fresh air replaced so that with long occupancy in a given enclosed space, concentrations of the virus can build up? This virus or any airborne illness. So I think that when I was the planning director in DC, we did a lot of work on energy efficient buildings, and a lot of that work was about actually, not doing as much circulation, not doing as much replacement because of the implications for energy efficiency. So I think there will be some changes with respect to this, and I think that that's something to be thinking about and looking for inexpensive ways to be able to do that. We built a lot of buildings with no operable windows, which is one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get fresh air into a building is to open a window. So yeah, I think going forward, this will be a consideration in the planning, design, and construction of buildings.
And,
Robert?
well, as it relates to transportation, I think it's the point that Harriet brought up earlier that we need to do a much better job at talking about how effective these cleaning systems are in both for public transit and in aviation. There are studies. There's all kinds of different examples showing that the concern that was expressed early on in the pandemic really doesn't manifest itself in reality in many of these places. So the transit agencies are doing an excellent job in cleaning. Aviation sector is doing an excellent job in cleaning. We need to do a much better job of getting those messages out there.
Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts on this. Robert Puentes, who's President and CEO of the Enos Center for Transportation. Harriet Tregoning is Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, has transformed Washington, D.C. in ways I really like. I want to thank you both for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back.
Pleasure. Thank you.